The forward operating base fell silent when the radio crackled with a transmission that made every operator in the Tactical Operations Center freeze mid-motion. The voice was steady, almost conversational, like someone ordering coffee rather than reporting catastrophic aircraft damage at 12,000 feet. Mongoose 37 to Bagram Tower, declaring emergency. Primary hydraulics gone, secondary failing, left wing compromised. Continuing station. The air traffic controller's hand hovered over his headset, eyes wide. Outside, a Navy SEAL team leader named Briggs dropped the ammunition belt he was loading and turned toward the distant mountains where a faint contrail marked the position of an aircraft that, according to every instrument reading transmitted to the tower, should already be a smoking crater. The A-10 Thunderbolt II call sign Mongoose 37 was flying a close air support mission over the Korangal Valley when an RPG round caught her in a climbing turn, the explosion shearing through the wing root with a sound like a cathedral bell cracking. The pilot, Captain Reina Vasquez, felt the aircraft lurch sideways as metal peeled away from metal, felt the stick go heavy in her hands as hydraulic fluid sprayed across her canopy, turning the Afghan sun into a blood-red haze. She had maybe 3 minutes of controllability left, maybe less. Below her, pinned down in a dried riverbed, a 12-man patrol was taking heavy fire from entrenched positions on 3 sides. She could see their infrared strobes through her targeting pod, could hear their forward air controllers' increasingly desperate calls for gun runs, for anything that might break the enemy's advance. Standard procedure said get the damaged aircraft away from the combat zone, head for the nearest runway, punch out if necessary. Standard procedure said a lot of things that didn't account for the fact that the patrol below included soldiers whose names she'd memorized from their mission brief, whose faces she'd studied in the pre-dawn darkness before launch. Reina Vasquez had learned long ago that some decisions couldn't be made from manuals or by committee. Some decisions lived in the space between what was survivable and what was right. She checked her fuel gauge enough for maybe 2 passes, then rolled the crippled Warthog into a shallow dive, the damaged wing groaning like a living thing in protest. The controller's voice came through again, urgent now, nearly shouting. Mongoose 37, recommend immediate egress, say intentions. Reina's thumb found the weapon's release as she lined up her first target. Her voice remained that same impossible calm. Intentions are to finish the mission. The rounds left the GAU-8 Avenger cannon at 65 per second, a sound like the earth itself tearing open, and the mountainside where insurgents had been massing for a final assault simply ceased to exist in any organized way. Reina fought the aircraft through the recoil, feeling the damaged wing flex and shudder, feeling every rivet in the airframe scream under stress loads the Fairchild Republic engineers had never intended any pilot to impose. The stick pulled hard left, trying to roll the aircraft into an unrecoverable spiral, and she muscled it back with both hands, boots braced against the rudder pedals, shoulders burning. Below, the SEAL team's forward air controller transmitted with barely controlled awe. Good hits, continue. But Reina could feel time running out through her fingertips where they gripped the stick, hydraulic pressure dropping, control surfaces responding in fractions when they should respond in degrees. The aircraft wanted to die. It was begging her to let it die, to accept the parachute, to make the sensible choice. She pulled up and came around for a second pass. When the news reached the operations center that Mongoose 37 was making another gun run, the silence broke into chaos. The tower controller was demanding she break off. The mission commander was calling for search and rescue alert. Someone mentioned ejection protocols. Briggs, the SEAL team leader, stood in the doorway watching the feed from a Predator drone circling overhead, watching the thermal image of an A-10 that flew like a wounded bird, one wing trailing debris, hydraulic fluid misting behind it in a visible streak. He'd seen a lot of brave things in 12 years of combat. He'd never seen anything like this. Reina lined up the second target, a heavy machine gun position that had the patrol's northern flank zeroed, and pressed the trigger for a 3-second burst that erased the position and everyone in it. The recoil hit the damaged wing like a hammer, and she felt something fundamental give way in the airframe, felt the whole aircraft twist sideways like a piece of paper caught in wind. Alarms screamed. Master caution lights blazed. The stick went nearly dead in her hands. She had seconds now, not minutes. The hydraulics were gone. She was flying on manual reversion, on cables and pulleys, on mechanical advantage and will. The patrol's air controller came through again. Mongoose 37, targets destroyed, good effect. You are cleared to egress. Raina checked her mirror's old habit from her first flying lessons, useless in combat but comforting somehow, and saw the wing. Really saw it. The entire left side from the engine nacelle outward was bent upward at a 30-degree angle, metal petals where panels had separated, the aileron hanging by control cables. She should have been in a flat spin. Physics said she should have been dead 4 minutes ago. She keyed the radio. Mongoose 37, beginning return to base. The 50 miles back to Bagram took 23 minutes that felt like hours compressed into heartbeats. Raina flew with a delicate touch, treating the aircraft like glass, like something sacred and fragile. Every input had to be calculated, gentle, precise. Too much rudder and the damaged wing would fold. Too aggressive, a turn and structural failure would be instant and complete. She flew by instinct and experience, by muscle memory earned through 4,000 hours in the cockpit, through missions over Iraq and Afghanistan, through training sorties where instructors had thrown every emergency at her that could be simulated. Nothing had simulated this. The Predator drone followed her, relaying video to every command post between Kabul and Tampa, and within minutes, the impossible sight was being watched by officers and analysts who'd never seen an A-10 fly with that kind of damage, never imagined one could. At Bagram, emergency crews staged. Ambulances lined the taxiway. Fire trucks positioned themselves with foam ready. The tower cleared every aircraft within 50 miles, gave Raina the longest runway, the straightest approach, everything that procedures and prayers could offer. Briggs and 3 of his teammates stood at the operations center window, watching the northern sky where Mongoose 37 would appear. Someone behind them whispered that the pilot was probably panicking, probably barely holding it together. Briggs didn't turn around, just kept watching the mountains. He'd heard that voice on the radio. That wasn't panic. That was something else entirely. Raina flew the approach at 180 knots, too fast for a normal landing, but she needed the speed for control authority, needed the airflow over what remained of her wing surfaces. She extended the landing gear and felt the aircraft shudder, felt drag and asymmetry trying to tear her out of the sky. The runway appeared through the canopy, looking impossibly narrow, impossibly short, though it was neither. She corrected for crosswind with rudder because the ailerons were barely responding, lined up on centerline through sheer determination and skill. The tower controller's voice was tight with tension. Mongoose 37, winds 270 at 8, runway 21 left, cleared to land. Raina didn't respond. She needed both hands and all her concentration. 50 feet. 30. The damaged wing dropped and she caught it with right rudder, felt the whole aircraft skew sideways, corrected with stick and throttle. 20 feet. 10. The main gear kissed concrete with a sound like deliverance. The nose wheel settled. She deployed the drag chute. The A-10 rolled straight and true for 300 feet before the weakened wing began to fail. Metal screamed as structural members gave way in sequence, as the wing that had somehow held together through combat and emergency flight finally surrendered to physics and gravity, and the accumulated damage of impossible stress. The entire left side folded upward, then collapsed, the aircraft settling onto the ruptured wing like a dying animal lying down. Raina felt the jolt through her seat, felt the aircraft slew left as one main gear left the runway surface. She cut the engines, safed the weapon systems, began emergency shutdown procedures with hands that moved through the checklist automatically, while her mind processed the fact that she was alive, on the ground, intact. The emergency crews swarmed before the aircraft fully stopped moving. Foam covered the wing. Fire trucks positioned themselves upwind. Medical personnel sprinted toward the cockpit with equipment they'd been certain they would need, with trauma protocols queued and ready. Raina popped the canopy and breathed air that tasted of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel and the particular dusty heat of Afghanistan in summer. She unstrapped, climbed out, dropped to the runway on legs that suddenly didn't want to hold her weight. The senior fire chief reached her first, already talking about shock and medical evaluation and procedures. Raina nodded but wasn't really hearing him. She was looking at the aircraft, at what she'd brought home. The left wing was no longer recognizable as a wing. It looked like something that had been through a shredder, that had been twisted and torn and somehow held together by rivets and desperation. The vertical stabilizer was pocked with shrapnel holes. Hydraulic fluid pooled under the fuselage in a spreading dark stain. Briggs arrived in a Humvee with his team, boots hitting the tarmac before the vehicle fully stopped. He walked past the emergency crews, past the officers who were starting to gather, walked right up to where Raina stood swaying slightly and extended his hand. "Captain Vasquez," he said, and his voice carried weight, carried respect that had nothing to do with rank. "That was the finest display of airmanship I've ever witnessed." Raina took his hand, found it steady and calloused and real. "Those guys in the riverbed make it out." Briggs nodded slowly. "Every single one, because of you." Something in Raina's chest finally released, some tension she'd been carrying since the first burst of ground fire, since the moment she'd felt the aircraft come apart around her. She nodded back, not trusting her voice for anything more substantial. The medical team insisted on taking Raina to the hospital despite her protests that she was fine, that she needed to file her after-action report, that there were procedures and debriefs and responsibilities. They won the argument through persistence, and the fact that her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't sign the preliminary forms the maintenance officer tried to give her. The hospital was quiet, efficient, mercifully brief. Blood pressure slightly elevated, heart rate still settling. No injuries beyond bruising from the harness during the violent maneuvering. The flight surgeon who examined her kept asking questions about her physical state that seemed to miss the point entirely. She'd flown a combat mission with half a wing and hydraulics that failed in stages. Her body was fine. Her mind was still processing what her body had done. They released her after 2 hours with instructions to rest, to hydrate, to report any symptoms of delayed shock. Raina signed the discharge papers and walked out into afternoon sun that felt different somehow, like she was seeing it through new filters. Back at the squadron spaces, word had spread. Pilots who'd been at other bases, who'd seen the Predator feed, who'd heard the radio calls, found reasons to stop by. Maintenance personnel who'd worked on her aircraft stood in small groups, talking in low voices about structural loads and failure points and the impossible physics of what they'd witnessed. The squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel named Garrett who'd flown F-16s before transitioning to a staff position, intercepted Raina before she reached her quarters. "Captain Vasquez, we need to talk." His tone suggested this wasn't optional. They walked to his office in silence. He closed the door, gestured for her to sit, poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since dawn. He didn't speak immediately, just studied her with eyes that had seen a lot of missions, a lot of pilots, a lot of decisions that lived in the gray spaces between regulations and reality. Finally he said, "You violated direct orders to egress. You put an aircraft worth $12 million and a pilot I can't replace in unnecessary danger. You disregarded tower instructions, emergency procedures, and basic risk management principles." He paused. "You also saved 12 lives and completed your mission under conditions that should have been impossible. So before I decide what official action to take, I need you to explain your reasoning." Raina met his eyes. "Those soldiers were going to die, sir. Not maybe, not probably, certainty. I had ordnance and a weapon system that still functioned. The aircraft was controllable barely. Controllable enough," Raina continued. "So I made a choice." Garrett set his coffee down, the cup clicking against the desk in the silence. "A choice that could have resulted in an aircraft crashing into friendly positions. A choice that could have left us searching for your body in the Hindu Kush. A choice that he stopped, rubbed his face with both hands. A choice that was objectively reckless and subjectively the right thing to do, which puts me in an interesting position. Raina said nothing. She'd known this conversation was coming from the moment she'd lined up that second gun run. The moment she'd felt the aircraft start to come apart and decided to push it anyway. Garrett stood, walked to his window that overlooked the flight line where Mongoose 37 sat surrounded by maintenance crews who were examining it with the intensity of archaeologists studying a newly discovered artifact. "You know what they're calling you already. The pilots, the ground crews." Raina shook her head. "The widow maker's mother." He turned back to her. "Because everyone knows the A-10 is the widow maker, toughest bird in the inventory, and you brought one home that should have killed you 6 different ways. That should have been scattered across a valley in pieces small enough to fit in your pockets." He returned to his desk, pulled out a file folder that looked official and ominous. "I'm recommending you for a Distinguished Flying Cross. I'm also recommending you for additional training on risk management and decision-making under pressure, because what you did today can never be used as a template for future actions. It was unique to unique circumstances." Raina felt something unclench in her chest. "Understood, sir." "I doubt you do, Captain." "Not yet." Garrett opened the folder, revealing forms and reports and photographs. "That's SEAL Team Leader Briggs. He submitted a letter that's already made it to division." The forward air controller submitted a field commendation that used words like extraordinary and unprecedented. "The maintenance chief who examined your aircraft called me personally to say he wants to meet the pilot who flew it, wants to understand what kind of person could keep that thing airborne." He closed the folder. "You're about to become famous in a community that doesn't usually celebrate pilots who break aircraft. Because you didn't break it, you flew it beyond its limits and brought it home anyway. That's a different thing entirely." The debriefs took 3 days and involved everyone from accident investigators to combat effectiveness analysts to officers Raina had never seen before who asked questions about her decision-making process, her training, her mindset during the critical moments. She answered honestly, which meant admitting she'd known the risks and accepted them, which meant acknowledging that she'd violated protocol and would do it again under similar circumstances. That honesty seemed to make some people uncomfortable, and others nod with grim understanding. Mongoose 37 became a monument on the flight line, a teaching tool, a legend. Maintenance crews gave tour to visiting personnel, pointing out where the wing had held together with what amounted to prayer and rivets, where the hydraulic lines had been shredded, where the control surfaces had been manually reverted. Pilots from other squadrons came to look, to touch the scarred metal, to try to imagine what it would take to fly something that damaged and survive. The SEAL team that Raina had covered arrived at Bagram 4 days after the incident, rotating back for rest and refit. Briggs found Raina in the chow hall, walked over with his entire team, and they stood there for a moment in a silence that felt heavy with things that didn't fit easily into words. "Ma'am," Briggs finally said, and his voice carried the rough edges of someone who'd seen the absolute worst moments humans could create and survived them. "My guys wanted to meet you, wanted to say thank you properly." The other SEALs nodded, these hard men with weathered faces and eyes that had seen things they'd never talk about to anyone who hadn't been there. One of them, a younger operator with a fresh scar across his forehead, extended his hand. "I'm Jenkins. I was on the riverbed when you made that second pass, when you should have been heading home but came around anyway." His hand was steady but his eyes weren't. "I got a daughter. She's 3. I was pretty sure I wasn't going to see her again until I heard those guns." Raina took his hand, felt the weight of what he was saying, the enormity of ordinary things like daughters and birthdays and future moments that had been preserved by decisions made at 12,000 feet in a disintegrating aircraft. "I have a son," she said quietly. "He's 5, so I understand." Jenkins nodded, seemed about to say something else, then just gripped her hand tighter before letting go. The other team members introduced themselves one by one, each with their own version of the same message: gratitude, respect, recognition of what she'd risked and what she'd given them. Briggs waited until his team stepped back, then moved closer, voice dropping so only Raina could hear. "You should know something. Before we deployed, we had briefings about air support, about what to expect, about capabilities and limitations. Every briefing emphasized calling for help early, trusting the pilots, working the integration. He paused. None of them prepared us for a pilot who would sacrifice herself for soldiers she'd never met. That's not in any manual. Raina felt heat rise in her face. I didn't sacrifice, you absolutely did. Briggs cut her off gently but firmly. You made a choice between your safety and ours, and you chose ours. That's the definition. The fact that you survived it doesn't change the calculus of the decision. He glanced back at his team. These men are the best at what they do, the absolute elite. They know talent when they see it, they know courage, they know competence. And every single one of them knows that you're at a level they respect completely. The word respect hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went beyond gratitude or professional appreciation. This was acknowledgement from warriors to warrior, recognition across service branches and specialties, and all the artificial divisions that separated people who ultimately all served the same cause. There's something else, Briggs continued. Something you need to hear from someone who understands how this community works. He waited until she met his eyes. You're a single mother flying combat missions. You've probably dealt with assumptions about your commitment, your focus, your ability to make hard calls under pressure. Raina's expression went carefully neutral. She had dealt with those assumptions, had dealt with them since she'd returned from maternity leave, since she'd filed the divorce papers, since she'd proved over and over that loving her son and being an exceptional pilot weren't mutually exclusive, but somehow still had to prove it again with every mission. Those assumptions are about to get very quiet, Briggs said. Because what you did keeping that aircraft together through pure skill and determination, making the choice to stay on station when every instinct probably screamed to run, bringing that broken bird home through sheer will, that's going to be the story that gets told. Not the bullshit about divided loyalties or split focus. He stepped back, came to attention, rendered a salute that was crisp and formal and carried more meaning than any words could. Captain Vasquez, it's been an honor. The weeks that followed brought changes Raina hadn't anticipated. The Air Force, that massive bureaucracy of regulations and procedures and careful image management, didn't quite know what to do with a pilot who'd become famous for technically violating multiple protocols while saving lives in spectacular fashion. The Distinguished Flying Cross recommendation moved forward with unusual speed, shepherded by officers who recognized good press when they saw it. Public Affairs wanted interviews. Stars and Stripes wanted a feature. Someone at the Pentagon wanted to use the incident as a training case study. Raina declined most of it, accepted what she couldn't avoid, and tried to focus on flying. But flying had changed too. Not in her skills or her confidence, those remained solid, earned through years of training and missions. What changed was how people treated her. Young pilots sought her advice with a reverence that felt uncomfortable. Maintenance crews worked on her aircraft with extra attention, extra care, as if proximity to Mongoose 37's pilot meant something. Ground commanders specifically requested her for close air support missions, trusting her judgment in ways that went beyond normal pilot-controller relationships. The attention was exhausting and humbling and occasionally surreal. She was the same person she'd been before that mission, the same pilot who'd been working twice as hard as her peers to prove that being a mother didn't make her less capable, less committed, less worthy of respect. But now that respect arrived without the constant requirement to earn it again with each mission, each decision, each interaction. Her squadron commander called her in 6 weeks after the incident. This time his expression was easier, less burdened by the weight of potential disciplinary action. The DFC recommendation was approved, Garrett said without preamble. There'll be a ceremony next month. Division commander wants to present it personally. Raina nodded, accepting the information without the false modesty that sometimes infected these conversations. She'd earned it. She knew she'd earned it. There's something else, Garrett continued. We've had requests from 3 different training commands. They want you to come teach, to share your experience, to help develop the next generation of A-10 pilots. He paused. One of those requests came from the weapons school. That's not something they offer lightly. The weapons school, the Air Force's equivalent to Top Gun, where the absolute best pilots want to become even better, to learn the tactics and techniques that would make them instructors and leaders. An assignment there was a career maker, a signal of exceptional skill and potential. Raina felt the weight of the offer, the enormity of what it represented. Teaching at the weapons school meant leaving combat operations, meant stepping back from the missions that had defined her adult life. It also meant more time with her son, meant stability and safety, and the chance to shape how future pilots thought about their profession. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. Garrett smiled slightly. "They'd like an answer in 30 days, but Captain, between us, this is the kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice. What you did with Mongoose 37, that wasn't just flying skill. That was judgment under pressure, tactical awareness, the ability to make impossible decisions in real time. Those are exactly the qualities the weapons school is looking for." That night Raina called her sister, who'd been watching her son during this deployment, who'd been the steady presence that made single motherhood and military service simultaneously possible. "Maya, I need to talk something through." Her sister's voice came through clear despite the satellite delay and distance. "What's wrong? You okay?" "I'm fine, better than fine, actually." Raina explained about the offer, about the implications and the decision and the uncertain future. Maya listened without interrupting, a skill she perfected over years of late-night calls and complicated conversations. "What does your gut say?" Maya finally asked. "My gut says I want to keep flying combat missions. That's where I'm effective, where I make a difference." "And your head?" "My head says teaching is how I make a bigger difference. Every pilot I train well, every technique I pass on, every bit of knowledge I share, that multiplies across years and missions and lives." Raina paused. "My heart says I miss my son, and I'm tired of explaining to daycare workers why mommy can't make the school play again." "Those are three different answers," Maya observed. "That's why I'm calling you." Maya laughed, the sound warm and familiar across the miles. "You already know what you're going to do. You're just making sure it's okay to choose it." She was right. Raina had known since Garrett made the offer, had felt the decision settling into place even as she pretended to consider options. She was going to take the teaching position. She was going to step back from combat missions and invest her skills and experience into making other pilots better, safer, more capable of handling the impossible situations that combat inevitably created. "You're going to be amazing at it," Maya continued. "Those pilots are going to learn from someone who doesn't just know the theory but lived it in the most extreme way possible." The ceremony for the Distinguished Flying Cross took place on a clear October morning when the Afghan sky looked almost benign, empty of the threats and violence that had filled it months earlier. The division commander, a two-star general named Morrison who'd flown A-10s in Desert Storm, presented the medal with words that emphasized heroism and skill and sacrifice. Briggs and his SEAL team attended in dress uniforms, standing in formation with other ground personnel whose lives had been directly affected by close air support missions. Other pilots from Raina's squadron filled the ranks, along with maintenance crews and support staff and officers from across the base. Morrison pinned the medal to Raina's chest, then stepped back and rendered a salute that felt like punctuation, like a statement that this recognition was more than ceremony. "Captain Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "you represent the absolute best of what it means to be an Air Force pilot. You demonstrated not just technical proficiency but moral courage, the willingness to risk everything for people who depended on you. That's the standard we aspire to. That's the example we want every pilot to follow." The applause that followed was genuine, sustained, heavy with respect. Raina stood at attention, feeling the weight of the medal and the moment, and all the future implications of being known as the pilot who'd brought Mongoose 37 home. After the ceremony, during the informal reception where coffee and conversation replaced formations and protocol, younger pilots approached with questions that went beyond technical details. They wanted to know about decision-making, about managing fear, about balancing duty and survival. Raina answered as honestly as she could, trying to convey that there were no simple formulas, no easy algorithms for impossible situations. You train until the procedures become instinct, she told a young lieutenant who looked like he was maybe 23, who probably hadn't faced anything more threatening than bad weather. You study the aircraft until you know its limits better than the engineers who designed it. And then when the moment comes, when you're facing something the manuals never covered, you trust that training and you make the best decision you can with the information available. The lieutenant nodded, absorbing this like gospel. But how do you know it's the right decision? Raina smiled slightly. You don't. Not in the moment. You just decide and commit and live with the consequences. The transition from combat pilot to weapons school instructor took 3 months and felt like stepping into a different life entirely. Raina returned to the United States, to Nevada where the weapons school operated, to a world where threats came from training scenarios instead of actual enemies, where missions were designed to teach rather than destroy. Her son barely recognized her at first, having grown and changed during her deployment in ways that photographs couldn't capture. He was taller, his vocabulary more complex, his understanding of the world expanded in that remarkable way children have of developing entire new capabilities in what feels like moments. They spent a week just relearning each other, going to parks, reading books, having conversations about kindergarten and friends, and why mommy had been gone so long. Maya watched these interactions with satisfaction, having held the family together during Raina's absence with a grace that made guilt and gratitude sit uncomfortably in Raina's chest. You did good, Maya said one evening after putting the boy to bed, after they'd settled into the quiet of adults who loved the same child. With him, with your career, with everything. I left him for a year, Raina said quietly. You served your country and saved lives and came home to be present now, Maya countered. Stop punishing yourself for having a career that requires sacrifice. He's proud of you. He tells everyone his mom flies planes and protects soldiers. At the weapons school, Raina found herself in classrooms and briefing rooms instead of cockpits, teaching pilots who were themselves already exceptional. These were the top performers from their units, the pilots who distinguished themselves through skill and judgment and were being groomed for leadership positions. Teaching them required a different kind of preparation than flying combat missions. She developed lesson plans around real scenarios, built case studies from her own experiences and the experiences of pilots she'd flown with. The Mongoose 37 incident became a module on decision-making under pressure, on understanding aircraft limits, on the difference between recklessness and calculated risk. The students approached it with a mix of awe and analytical interest, asking questions that forced Raina to articulate instincts she'd previously just acted on. When you felt the wings start to fail, what was your decision process for staying on station? One captain asked during a classroom session. Raina considered the question carefully. I evaluated 3 things in about 2 seconds. Could I complete the mission? Could I survive completing it? And what happened if I didn't complete it? The answers were probably yes, maybe, and soldiers die. That made the choice clear. Another student, a major with combat experience in both Iraq and Afghanistan, pushed back gently. But maybe on surviving, that's not a comfortable risk calculation. It wasn't comfortable, Raina agreed. Risk calculations under pressure rarely are. But I trusted my ability to handle the aircraft, trusted the A-10's toughness, trusted that if things went completely wrong, I still had an ejection seat. Those trust factors shifted the maybe closer to probably. The conversations ranged across tactical decisions and ethical considerations and practical questions about maintaining control authority in degraded flight conditions. Raina found herself energized by teaching in ways she hadn't expected, found satisfaction in watching comprehension dawn in students' faces when complex concepts clicked into place. 6 months into the assignment, the commandant of the weapons school called her in for what he described as a routine check-in. Colonel Hayes was a former F-15 pilot who transitioned to A-10s mid-career and had the easy confidence of someone who'd proven himself in multiple domains. Captain Vasquez, I wanted to get your impression of how things are going, Hayes said, gesturing for her to sit. The teaching the students, the adjustment to being back in the States. Raina settled into the chair. It's been good, sir. Different from flying combat missions, but valuable in ways I'm still processing. Hayes nodded. Your students speak highly of you. The feedback forms are consistently excellent. You've brought a level of practical experience that's exactly what we need. He paused, studying her with eyes that suggested this conversation had layers beyond simple performance review. I'm wondering about your long-term plans, whether you've thought about staying in this role, making instruction a permanent career path rather than a temporary assignment. The question caught Raina slightly off guard. She'd been focused on the immediate work, on being present for her son, on adjusting to life without the adrenaline edge of combat operations. The future had remained vague and undefined. I haven't thought that far ahead, she admitted. Hayes leaned back in his chair. The Air Force needs pilots like you in multiple roles. We need you flying combat missions, yes. But we also need you teaching, mentoring, shaping how the next generation thinks about the profession. Both are valuable. Both make a difference. He pulled out a folder that looked ominously official. I'm offering you a follow-on assignment here at the school, a 3-year position developing curriculum and teaching advanced tactics. The weight of the offer settled over Raina like gravity, like something inevitable and important. 3 years of stability. 3 years with her son in the same house, the same school, the same life. 3 years of teaching instead of deploying, of building instead of just executing. It was seductive and practical, and exactly what part of her had been hopping for without quite admitting it. Can I think about it? She asked. Hayes smiled. Of course. Take 2 weeks, talk to whoever you need to talk to, and give me an answer by the end of the month. That evening Raina called her sister again, replaying the conversation with Hayes and seeking the external perspective that Maya provided better than anyone else in her life. 3 years teaching, Maya said thoughtfully. 3 years here with him growing up and you being present for it. But also 3 years not flying combat missions, Raina countered. Not being where the actual work happens. The actual work happens wherever you are, Maya said firmly. Stop thinking of teaching as less important than combat. You're literally shaping the pilots who will fly those combat missions for the next 20 years. That's not secondary, that's foundational. Raina sat with that thought, turning it over in her mind like a stone whose weight and texture needed careful examination. Maya was right. Teaching wasn't a step back, it was a different kind of forward, one that built legacy instead of just accumulating missions. I'm going to take it, Raina said quietly. Good, Maya replied. Now come visit this weekend. Your son wants to show you his science project about airplanes. Wonder where he got that interest from. The decision brought peace that Raina hadn't quite expected. She informed Hayes of her acceptance, signed the paperwork that made it official, and settled into the work of being an instructor with renewed commitment. The months rolled forward with the steady rhythm of teaching cycles classes and flight evaluations, curriculum development and student counseling, the intricate work of taking exceptional pilots and making them even better. Word spread in the tactical aviation community about the weapons school instructor who brought home Mongoose 37, about the lessons learned from that mission, about the pilot who'd chosen teaching over continued combat operations. Raina found herself receiving invitations to speak at other training commands, at symposiums and conferences where senior officers gathered to discuss tactics and doctrine and the future of close air support. She accepted some invitations and declined others, always evaluating whether her participation would genuinely contribute to improving how pilots thought about their craft. At a symposium in Virginia, she presented a case study on emergency decision-making that drew on the Mongoose 37 mission without making herself the hero of the story. She focused on the systematic evaluation of options, the importance of aircraft knowledge, the critical role of trusting one's training when situations exceeded normal parameters. During the question period afterward, a colonel from Air Combat Command stood and asked a question that felt less like inquiry and more like statement. Captain Vasquez, some would argue that your decision to continue the mission with a damaged aircraft set a dangerous precedent, that it encourages pilots to take unnecessary risks. The room went quiet. Raina met the colonel's eyes and recognized the question for what it was, a test of whether she'd defend her choices or retreat to comfortable platitudes. "Sir, I'd argue the opposite," she said calmly. Dangerous precedent would be teaching pilots that technical limits matter more than mission accomplishment, that personal safety always trumps unit success. We train warriors, not technicians. Warriors understand that sometimes the right choice is the hard choice, the dangerous choice, the choice that can't be justified by regulations but can be defended by results. She paused, gathering her thoughts. That said, what I did shouldn't be normalized or expected. It was specific to specific circumstances. The teaching point isn't ignore aircraft damage, it's understand your aircraft well enough to know what's truly impossible versus what's merely inadvisable. Those are different thresholds. The colonel nodded slowly, seeming satisfied if not entirely convinced. After the panel, several younger officers approached Raina with their own questions, their own stories of difficult decisions and unclear situations. She listened more than she talked, recognizing in their experiences the universal challenges of military aviation, the constant tension between safety and mission, between protocol and pragmatism, between individual preservation and collective responsibility. Flying back to Nevada that night, Raina looked out at darkness interrupted by scattered lights from towns and cities below, thinking about legacy and impact, and the strange paths that led people to their roles. She'd become a pilot to fly, to experience the freedom and challenge of controlling complex machines through three-dimensional space. She'd become an instructor almost accidentally, through a series of events that had started with an RPG round in Afghanistan and ended with a teaching position she'd never specifically sought. But now, 18 months into the role, she understood that teaching was flying in a different way, guiding people instead of aircraft, navigating through concepts and challenges rather than airspace, finding the right approach vectors for understanding instead of landing. Both required precision, patience, and the ability to adapt when conditions changed unexpectedly. Her son started first grade with enthusiasm that made morning drop-offs easier than they had any right to be. He talked about his teachers, his friends, his nascent interest in science and building things. He asked questions about flying that became more sophisticated as his understanding grew, not just how high do planes go, but why does air moving faster over a wing create lift, and what makes jet engines work. Raina answered as honestly and clearly as she could, watching him absorb information with the same intensity she brought to flight manuals. One evening, as she tucked him into bed, he looked up at her with serious eyes and asked the kind of question children sometimes ask that hits harder than adult inquiries. "Mommy, were you scared when your airplane broke?" Raina considered lying, considered deflecting, considered all the parental instincts to protect children from uncomfortable truths. But she'd built her career on honesty and clear-eyed assessment of reality. "Yes," she said simply. "I was scared. The airplane was damaged badly and I wasn't sure I could keep it flying." "But you did keep it flying," he said with absolute confidence. "How?" "Training," Raina said. "Lots and lots of practice. When you practice something enough, even when you're scared, your hands remember what to do. Your brain remembers the steps. That's why we practice things, so when it matters, we're ready." He thought about this with the intense concentration of a 6-year-old processing complex ideas. "I want to practice things so I'm ready when it matters." Raina kissed his forehead, feeling the weight and gift of that statement. "Then you will be, I promise." The years at the weapons school accumulated into expertise of a different kind than combat flying had provided. Raina developed a reputation as an instructor who pushed students hard but fairly, who demanded excellence but explained the reasoning behind standards, who brought real-world experience into every classroom session and flight evaluation. Her students went on to squadrons across the Air Force, carrying with them the lessons and perspectives she'd imparted, becoming themselves instructors and flight leads and commanders who shaped how their units approached the mission. She watched this ripple effect with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that her influence had expanded beyond what any single pilot could accomplish through individual missions. In her third year at the weapons school, Raina was promoted to major, the promotion board's comments specifically noting her contributions to tactical aviation instruction and her demonstrated courage under fire. The promotion ceremony was small and informal, just her squadron and a few senior officers, but it felt significant in ways that went beyond rank. It was recognition that teaching mattered, that the path she'd chosen was valued and valuable. Colonel Hayes, who'd been promoted himself to brigadier general and moved to a position at Air Combat Command, attended the ceremony and pulled Reina aside afterward. "Major Vasquez, I wanted to tell you personally that we're watching your career with great interest. The work you've done here developing that curriculum on decision-making under pressure, mentoring junior instructors, raising the standard for what we expect from weapons school graduates, that's exactly the kind of leadership the Air Force needs." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We're considering you for a position on the air staff in a few years, something that would put you in policy development, in shaping how we train and equip and organize for future operations. That's typically a lieutenant colonel position, but we're willing to wait for your promotion to catch up to your capabilities." The idea of working in the Pentagon, of influencing decisions at the service level rather than the tactical level, was both appealing and daunting. It would mean leaving flying almost entirely, becoming a staff officer who worked with briefings and budgets instead of aircraft and missions. It would also mean having impact that scaled across the entire Air Force, shaping decisions that affected thousands of pilots and hundreds of aircraft. "I'm honored, sir," Reina said carefully, "and I'll definitely consider it when the time comes." Hayes smiled knowingly. "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you're not sure you want to be a staff officer." "I became a pilot to fly," Reina admitted. "Moving further from that, it's a difficult calculation." "I understand completely," Hayes said. "I wrestled with the same question when they offered me my first staff position. What I eventually realized was that flying comes in many forms. Sometimes it's stick and rudder. Sometimes it's guiding organizational direction. Both take skill and both matter." That conversation stayed with Reina through the months that followed, coloring how she thought about her career trajectory and long-term goals. She was 34 years old enough to have accumulated significant experience but young enough that decades of service still stretched ahead. The choices she made now would shape not just her life, but the lives of pilots she taught, organizations she influenced, policies she helped develop. It was a weight that felt both burdensome and energizing. She found herself having conversations with other female pilots about career paths and choices, about how to balance professional ambitions with personal lives, about whether it was possible to be both a committed mother and a dedicated officer. These conversations often circled back to the same fundamental questions: what constituted success, what sacrifices were acceptable, what legacy mattered most. "You're a role model whether you want to be or not," a young captain named Torres told her during one such conversation. They were sitting in the squadron building after a long day of instruction, coffee going cold in cups they'd forgotten about. "Every female pilot in the Air Force knows your story. They know you flew Mongoose 37 home. They know you're teaching at the weapons school. They know you have a kid and you're making it work. That matters." Reina shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just doing my job." "No," Torres said firmly. "You're doing your job exceptionally well while being visible and present, and not apologizing for having a life outside the cockpit. That's different. That's important." The recognition felt uncomfortable and accurate in equal measure. Reina hadn't set out to be a role model or representative for anyone beyond herself. But Torres was right. Visibility mattered, representation mattered, demonstrating that excellence and motherhood weren't mutually exclusive mattered. Whether she'd chosen that role or not, she occupied it. Her son grew from first grade into second and then third, becoming more independent and confident and curious about the world. His questions evolved from simple mechanics to complex systems, from how to why, from concrete facts to abstract principles. Reina found herself challenged by his intelligence in ways that felt similar to teaching advanced tactics, requiring her to break down assumptions, examine foundational knowledge, Explain not just what was true, but why it was true and how she knew. "Mom," he asked one Saturday while they worked on a science project together, "why did you become a pilot?" Raina set down the model airplane they were building, a remarkably detailed A-10 kit he'd requested for his birthday. "I wanted to fly. I wanted to do something that mattered, that helped people, that required skill and courage." He considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "Did you know it would be dangerous?" "Yes. That's part of what makes it meaningful, doing something important even though it's hard." "Is teaching dangerous?" The question caught her off guard, revealing layers of understanding she hadn't expected from an 8-year-old. "Not in the same way, but it's important. Maybe more important, because when I teach a pilot to make good decisions, that affects every mission they fly for their entire career." He nodded, accepting this logic with the same matter-of-fact confidence he applied to mathematics and building projects. "You're good at important things." The simple statement carried more weight than elaborate praise from senior officers. This was her son's assessment of her life's work, delivered without agenda or complication. "You're good at important things." It felt like the most accurate performance evaluation she'd ever received. That summer, 10 years after she'd brought Mongoose 37 home, the Air Force Historical Foundation reached out with a request. They were developing an exhibit on close air support operations in Afghanistan, and they wanted to feature her mission as a centerpiece. Would she be willing to be interviewed, to provide artifacts if any existed, to participate in the development of educational materials? Raina agreed, with the caveat that the focus should be on the mission and the aircraft, not on her personally. The Foundation's historian, a retired colonel named Patterson who'd written extensively on tactical aviation, conducted the interview over 2 days in Nevada. His questions were detailed and probing, going beyond the technical aspects of the flight to explore decision-making processes, emotional responses, and long-term impacts. "When you realized the wing was failing but chose to stay on station," Patterson asked during the second day, "what was going through your mind?" Raina thought back to that moment, to the feel of the stick going heavy in her hands, to the knowledge that every second delayed her egress was a second closer to catastrophic failure. "I was thinking about probabilities and consequences. Probability I could complete the mission high. Probability I could survive completing it uncertain but not impossible. Consequences of not completing it, soldiers die." The mathematics seemed clear. "But that's not just mathematics," Patterson observed. "That's values. That's a statement about what matters most, the mission over personal survival." Raina nodded slowly. "I suppose it is, but in that moment it didn't feel philosophical, it felt practical. I had capabilities they needed. The risk was mine to take." Patterson made notes in his leather journal, old school and thorough. "You've become somewhat legendary in the tactical aviation community. Does that sit comfortably with you?" "No," Raina admitted. "I did what needed doing, so have thousands of other pilots in thousands of other situations. The fact that mine became visible doesn't make it more important." "But visibility matters," Patterson said, echoing Tor's words from years earlier. "Your mission became a teaching case, a standard for decision-making under pressure. That visibility multiplied its impact beyond the immediate tactical success." He paused. "Tell me about teaching. About how you've translated your experience into instruction." Raina spent the next hour discussing curriculum development, teaching philosophy, the challenges of conveying instinctive knowledge through explicit instruction. Patterson listened with the focus of someone who understood that teaching was itself a form of combat, a different kind of mission with different metrics of success. The exhibit opened 18 months later at the Air Force Museum in Ohio, a comprehensive display featuring photographs, video footage from the Predator drone, recovered pieces from Mongoose 37, and interactive displays explaining the tactical situation and decisions made. Raina attended the opening with her son, now 10 years old and intensely interested in seeing his mother's story presented as history. They walked through the exhibit together, Raina providing additional context that the displays couldn't capture: the sound of alarms in the cockpit, the smell of hydraulic fluid, the the texture of fear and determination that lived beneath technical decisions. Her son stopped at a display showing the damaged wing, now preserved behind glass, metal twisted and torn, but still recognizable as something that had once provided lift and control. He reached out, not quite touching the glass, studying the destruction with analytical interest. "You flew this," he said, statement rather than question. "I did. It should have fallen apart. Yes, it should have." He turned to look at her, his eyes carrying understanding that went beyond his years. "You were brave." Raina knelt down to his level. "I was scared and trained and determined. Brave was just what it looked like from outside." The years continued their steady progression, marked by teaching cycles and her son's growth and small accumulations of recognition that built into career advancement. Raina made lieutenant colonel at 15 years of service, the promotion coming with assignment to Air Combat Command Headquarters, where she developed doctrine for close air support operations. It was the staff position Hayes had predicted, the transition from tactical flying to strategic thinking. Her son was 12 by then, old enough to understand that this assignment meant staying in one place, meant her deployments were over, meant stability and presence that had been intermittent through his childhood. He expressed relief with a transparency that made Raina's heart ache slightly, recognition of how her absence had affected him even though she'd been doing important work. The staff position was different in every way from flying or teaching. The pace was slower, but the implications were broader. Decisions made in conference rooms and written into doctrine documents affected how entire weapon systems were employed, how pilots were trained, how resources were allocated. Raina found herself working with officers from all services: Army officers who depended on close air support, Navy planners who coordinated joint operations, Marine aviators with their own perspectives on air-ground integration. The work required political skill alongside tactical knowledge, required building consensus and navigating institutional priorities, and translating operational experience into policy language that could survive bureaucratic review. It was intellectually demanding and occasionally frustrating and ultimately satisfying in ways that surprised her. 3 years into the staff assignment, Raina was selected to attend the Air War College, the senior professional military education that prepared officers for strategic leadership positions. The year at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama was intensive and transformative, focused on national security strategy, joint operations, and the broader context within which tactical decisions operated. She studied military history and international relations, wrote papers on airpower theory and emerging technologies, engaged in war games and strategic planning exercises that stretched her thinking beyond the cockpit and classroom. The other students were colonels and lieutenant colonels from all services, high performers selected for their potential to serve at senior levels. Raina found herself in seminars with infantry officers who'd commanded battalions in combat, with Navy submarine commanders who'd spent months underwater, with cyber operations specialists who fought wars in digital domains she barely understood. The diversity of experience and perspective was humbling and educational. Her thesis project examined decision-making under pressure in combat aviation, drawing on her own experience with Mongoose 37, but expanding to analyze dozens of similar incidents across services and conflicts. She interviewed pilots who'd made critical decisions in damaged aircraft, studied accident reports and after-action reviews, developed a framework for understanding how training, experience, and individual psychology interacted during high-stress situations. The thesis was published in the Air War College Journal and subsequently republished in several professional military publications, gaining attention from training commands and safety organizations across the Defense Department. It established Raina as a thought leader on combat decision-making, someone whose perspective combined practical experience with analytical rigor. After graduating from the War College, Raina returned to Air Combat Command with a new assignment focused on developing next-generation close air support doctrine. The A-10 was aging, and debates raged about what should replace it, how future conflicts would require different approaches to supporting ground forces, how emerging technologies like drones and precision weapons changed tactical calculus. Reyna found herself in the center of these debates, bringing credibility earned through combat experience and thought leadership developed through years of teaching and study. She testified before congressional committees about close air support requirements, briefed senior leaders on tactical innovations, wrote doctrine that would guide operations for the next decade. The work was important and visible and far removed from flying warthogs over Afghanistan. Sometimes she missed the simplicity of tactical missions, the clarity of being in the cockpit with specific objectives and immediate feedback. But she also recognized that her current work had impact that individual missions could never achieve, that policy and doctrine shaped thousands of missions rather than just one. Her son entered high school, a milestone that felt impossibly distant from the 5-year-old she'd left before deploying to Afghanistan. He'd grown tall and thoughtful, interested in engineering and physics, talking about college with a seriousness that suggested he'd already been planning for years. He asked about her work occasionally, demonstrating polite interest that sometimes deepened into genuine curiosity when topics intersected with his own studies. "Mom," he asked one evening during dinner, "do you miss flying?" The question was direct and perceptive in the way his questions had become, getting to the heart of things without preamble. "Sometimes," Reyna answered honestly. "I miss the immediacy, the directness of the work." "But you wouldn't go back?" "No," she said after considering. "What I do now matters in different ways, bigger ways maybe, and I'm here with you, watching you grow up. That matters too." He nodded, satisfied with this answer in a way that suggested he'd been seeking reassurance more than information. They were building a relationship as he matured that felt different from parent-child dynamics, moving toward something more like mentorship and friendship without losing the foundation of family. Reyna made colonel at 22 years of service, a milestone that put her in the senior leadership ranks. The promotion came with assignment as vice commander of an operations group, a position that returned her to units that flew and fought rather than just planned and strategized. It meant going back to bases with flight lines, to squadrons with aircraft and pilots, to the tangible reality of tactical aviation rather than its theoretical and policy dimensions. The operations group was based in South Carolina, flying A-10s in support of Army units stationed at nearby Fort Bragg. Reyna arrived as the senior operational leader responsible for training, readiness, and mission execution across multiple squadrons. It was hands-on leadership that required her to be visible and engaged, to know her pilots and their capabilities, to make decisions about risk and readiness and resource allocation. She flew again, though less frequently than in her younger years, maintaining currencies and demonstrating that she remained proficient despite years away from regular cockpit time. The pilots in her group, many of them younger than her son had been when she'd flown Mongoose 37 home, treated her with a respect that went beyond rank. They knew her history, knew the mission that had become legend, knew she'd taught at the weapons school and written doctrine and testified before Congress. She was, in their eyes, everything a senior leader should be: operationally credible, strategically minded, personally proven under the worst conditions combat could create. Reyna worked to deserve that respect through daily actions rather than past achievements. She spent time on the flight line with maintenance crews, sat in on mission planning sessions, debriefed flights with attention to detail that helped pilots improve. She pushed for realistic training that prepared her squadrons for actual combat rather than just satisfying checkbox requirements. She advocated for her people with higher headquarters, fighting for resources and recognition and opportunities that would develop them into the next generation of leaders. 2 years into the assignment, one of her pilots, a captain named Morrison, no relation to the general who'd presented her DFC years, earlier experienced a catastrophic engine failure during a training mission. The aircraft was over water, too far from any runway for a safe landing, and Morrison was preparing to eject when Reyna, flying as mission commander that day, talked him through an emergency procedure that kept the engine producing partial power long enough to reach an emergency field. Successful recovery was noteworthy, but not remarkable. Engine failures happened. Emergency procedures existed. Pilots trained for exactly these situations. What made it significant was the conversation afterward when Morrison sought out Raina in her office. "Ma'am," he said, still in his flight suit, "I wanted to thank you for the assist. I was about to punch out, was absolutely convinced the engine was done, and you caught something I missed." Raina gestured for him to sit. "You did fine, Captain. Caught the emergency, ran the procedures, made the right decision to prepare for ejection. The fact that we found an alternative just means the system worked." "The system worked because you were there," Morrison said. "Because you've got more experience than anyone else in the group, because you've been in situations where the book answer wasn't available." He paused, seeming to gather courage for something difficult. "I need to tell you something. When I first got assigned here, when I heard you were going to be the vice commander, I was skeptical." Raina kept her expression neutral. "Skeptical how?" "Skeptical that someone who'd been away from tactical flying for so long could still be relevant. Skeptical that your reputation was really deserved or just good PR. Skeptical that you'd understand what we're dealing with day to day." His honesty was refreshing if uncomfortable. "And now I'm embarrassed I ever thought that," Morrison said bluntly. "You're the most operationally competent leader I've served under. You understand the aircraft better than pilots with twice my hours. You make decisions faster and better than anyone I've seen. And today you saved my aircraft and possibly my life by seeing something everyone else missed." He stood, came to attention. "I wanted to apologize for my initial attitude and thank you for demonstrating what real leadership looks like." After Morrison left, Raina sat in the quiet of her office thinking about perception and proof, about how female officers still had to demonstrate competence repeatedly where male officers' competence was assumed until proven otherwise. She dealt with this her entire career, had accepted it as the cost of serving in a profession still dominated by men who sometimes struggled to see past gender to capability. But Morrison's confession suggested something shifting, that younger officers were learning to question their assumptions, that demonstrated competence eventually overcame bias, that leadership by example actually worked even if it required patience and persistence. That evening she called her sister, a ritual they'd maintained for decades despite busy schedules and time zones. Maya was now a successful attorney, married with 2 children of her own, living a life that looked nothing like Raina's but shared the same foundational values of service and competence, and showing up for important things. "How's the colonel life treating you?" Maya asked with affection and slight teasing. "Exhausting and satisfying," Raina said. She recounted the day's events, Morrison's confession, the ongoing work of proving herself despite decades of service. Maya listened with the attentiveness that made her excellent at both lawyering and sisterhood. "You know what strikes me," Maya said when Raina finished. "How much things have changed since you were a captain flying combat missions. Back then you were fighting for basic respect, for the chance to prove you belonged in a cockpit. Now you're a colonel commanding squadrons, writing doctrine, mentoring the next generation. That's not just your personal success, that's progress for everyone who follows." "It doesn't always feel like progress," Raina admitted. "Sometimes it feels like fighting the same battles over and over. But you're fighting them from higher ground each time," Maya countered. "And the fact that young officers like Morrison can recognize their own biases and apologize, that's different from the environment you faced as a lieutenant. That's your legacy showing up in real time." The concept of legacy had been abstract for most of Raina's career, something to think about eventually, something that belonged to retirement or late career reflection. But Maya was right, legacy wasn't just the final summation of a career. It was the accumulated effect of choices and actions and examples set across decades, visible in how people who'd never flown with her still knew her story, how pilots she'd taught were themselves now teaching, how doctrine she'd written shaped missions being flown today. Her son graduated high school with honors and acceptance to MIT's aerospace engineering program. The achievement felt inevitable given his aptitude and work ethic, but it also marked a transition point that made Raina acutely aware of time's passage. The boy she'd left before deploying to Afghanistan, the 5-year-old who'd barely understood why mommy had to go away, was now a young man heading off to study the science underlying the aircraft she'd spent her career flying. At his graduation party, surrounded by friends and family, and the accumulated evidence of 18 years of parenting, her son pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Mom, I wanted to tell you something before I head off to college." His voice carried that particular seriousness he'd had since childhood, the intensity that appeared when he was working through important thoughts. "Growing up with you gone sometimes, with you deploying and training and being away, I won't lie and say it was easy." Raina felt her chest tighten, preparing for criticism she probably deserved. "But watching you be excellent at what you do, watching you serve and lead and make a difference, that taught me more than being home every day would have. You showed me that meaningful work requires sacrifice, that competence matters, that integrity isn't negotiable." He paused, and Raina saw tears in his eyes that he was trying to control. "I'm proud to be your son. I'm proud to tell people what you do, and I hope I can be half as good at what I choose as you've been at flying and teaching and leading." Raina pulled him into a hug, feeling him solid and tall and grown, feeling the weight of years and choices and consequences that had led to this moment. "You're going to be better than half as good," she said quietly. "You're going to be extraordinary." The years that followed brought continued advancement and evolving responsibilities. Raina made Brigadier General at 28 years of service, a milestone that put her among the senior leadership of the Air Force with authority over thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in equipment. The star came with assignment as commander of an Air Expeditionary Wing, a position that combined operational leadership with strategic oversight, that required her to think about campaigns rather than missions, about force posturing rather than individual sorties. She deployed to the Middle East to command combat operations against emerging threats, coordinating air assets from multiple services and allied nations, making decisions about targeting and rules of engagement and resource allocation. It was the culmination of everything she'd learned across 3 decades tactical proficiency from her early flying years, teaching skills from the weapons school, strategic perspective from staff assignments, leadership principles from commanding squadrons. She was, by objective measure, at the peak of professional effectiveness. But she was also 52 years old, aware that her time in service was approaching its natural conclusion, beginning to think about what came after the uniform. Retirement wasn't immediate or imminent. She had at least 5 more years of productive service, possibly more if opportunities for advancement continued. But the concept of life after military service started appearing in her thinking, coloring decisions about what assignments to pursue, what legacy to prioritize, what final contributions to make. Her son graduated from MIT and went directly to work for a defense contractor, developing next-generation fighter aircraft. The symmetry pleased Raina. She'd spent her career flying aircraft designed by previous generations of engineers, and now her son would help design aircraft that future pilots would fly. The cycle continued, each generation building on what came before, each contribution connecting to larger purposes. On a quiet evening in her quarters in the Middle East, Raina received a message from the Air Force Historical Foundation. The exhibit about Mongoose 37 was being expanded, updated with new material about her subsequent career, about how that single mission had launched decades of service and leadership. Would she be willing to provide additional input, to participate in developing educational materials that would help future officers understand career development and leadership principles? She agreed, and over subsequent weeks engaged in conversations with historians and educators about trajectory and choices, about how individual moments connected to longer arcs, about what made careers meaningful. These conversations forced her to articulate things she'd mostly operated on instinct about: why teaching had been important, why staff work mattered, why leadership at senior levels required different skills than tactical proficiency. When you look back at your career, one historian asked during a video interview, "What are you most proud of?" Raina considered the question carefully. "Not a single thing, the accumulation of things, the missions I flew well, the pilots I taught, the doctrine I helped develop, the example I tried to set about competence and integrity, all of it together is what matters. And Mongoose 3-7, that mission is what you're known for. That mission is how people know my name," Raina corrected gently. "But it's not the most important thing I did. It's just the most visible." She paused, organizing thoughts that had been forming across years. The most important things were probably invisible. The students who became better pilots because I taught them well. The decisions that prevented accidents I'll never know about. The small moments of mentorship that might have changed someone's career trajectory. The historian nodded, seeming to understand. Legacy isn't always in the dramatic moments. "Exactly," Raina said. "Legacy is in the daily work, the accumulated competence, the example set consistently across time. The dramatic moments just give people a reason to pay attention to everything else." After 32 years of service, Brigadier General Reina Vasquez retired at a ceremony held on a perfect autumn day at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington. The attendees included generals and colonels and enlisted personnel from across her career, pilots she'd taught who were now themselves instructors and commanders, officers she'd mentored who spoke about her impact on their development. Briggs attended, now himself retired from the SEALs, bringing several members of his old team to honor the pilot who'd covered their extraction from the Korangal Valley 3 decades earlier. The Air Force Chief of Staff presented her retirement certificate with words about service and sacrifice and leadership that exemplified Air Force values. But the moment that stuck with Raina came during the informal reception afterward, when a young female lieutenant approached with visible nervousness. "General Vasquez, I'm Lieutenant Chen. I'm starting A-10 training next month." She paused, gathering courage. "I just wanted to tell you that I joined the Air Force because of your story. Because you showed that being a woman and a mother didn't mean I couldn't be an exceptional pilot. Thank you for making that visible." Raina felt the weight of that gratitude, the responsibility of representation she'd never sought but had carried anyway. "Lieutenant, you're going to be exceptional because of your own skill and determination, not because of me. But I'm honored to have played even a small part in your decision to serve." After Chen walked away, Raina's son, now himself 27, successful in his career, engaged to be married, appeared at her elbow with a glass of champagne. "That happened a lot, people telling you that you inspired them. More than I expected," Raina admitted. "Less than my ego would like to believe I deserve." He laughed, the sound carrying warmth and deep affection. "You deserve it, Mom. You deserve all of it, the recognition, the respect, the gratitude. You earned it by being excellent for 3 decades without apology or compromise." They stood together, mother and son, watching the reception continue around them, watching the community she'd served celebrate her service. Raina thought about the long arc from that first mission as a young lieutenant to this retirement ceremony as a general, about all the choices and challenges and consequences that had filled the years between. About bringing Mongoose 3-7 home with a broken wing, about teaching at the weapons school, about writing doctrine and commanding wings and eventually wearing a star. She thought about her son growing up with a mother who deployed and served and sometimes missed important moments, about the sacrifices that military service required from families as much as from service members themselves. She thought about the pilots she'd taught, the officers she'd mentored, the doctrine she'd written, the example she'd tried to set about competence and integrity, and the possibility of excellence without excuses. And she thought about that RPG round in Afghanistan 32 years ago, about the split-second decision to stay on station rather than run for safety, about how that choice had somehow set in motion everything that followed. Not because the choice itself was special, but because it had become visible, had become known, had given people a reason to pay attention to all the work that came afterward. Legacy, she realized, wasn't something you built intentionally. It was something that accumulated from doing your job well, from making good decisions consistently, from showing up day after day with competence and commitment. The dramatic moments just illuminated the foundation. "Mom," her son's voice pulled her back to the present. "You okay?" "Yeah," Raina said, smiling. "Just thinking about everything, about what comes next." "What does come next?" She looked at him, at this young man who turned out remarkably well despite her imperfect parenting, at the gathered crowd of people whose lives she'd touched in ways large and small, at the future that was open and undefined. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm looking forward to finding out." 20 years after her retirement, on the 50th anniversary of the Mongoose 37 mission, the Air Force held a symposium on combat aviation decision-making at the weapons school where Raina had taught. She attended at age 72, her son beside her, two grandchildren fascinated by the displays of aircraft and exhibits about their grandmother's career. The A-10 had finally been fully retired, replaced by newer aircraft that she barely recognized, but the principles she'd taught and the examples she'd set remained relevant across platforms and generations. The symposium featured speakers from across the aviation community, but the keynote was delivered by now Major General Morrison, the pilot whose engine failure Raina had helped troubleshoot decades earlier. He spoke about leadership and mentorship, about learning from those who'd gone before, about the importance of examples that showed what excellence looked like. And he spoke about Raina specifically, about how one career could illuminate principles that transcended individual circumstances. Brigadier General Vasquez showed us that competence isn't about drama or visibility, Morrison said to the assembled audience of current and former pilots. It's about consistency and judgment and the willingness to make hard choices in impossible situations. She flew Mongoose 37 home not because she was seeking glory, but because soldiers needed her support and she could provide it. She taught at this school not because it was prestigious, but because sharing knowledge mattered. She served for 32 years not because she needed the recognition, but because the mission required commitment. That's the standard. That's what we should aspire to, not the individual heroic moments, but the decades of steady competence that make those moments possible. After the keynote, a permanent exhibit was unveiled, a section of Mongoose 37's damaged wing preserved behind glass, accompanied by photographs and video and educational materials about decision-making under pressure. Raina stood before it with her grandchildren, explaining in simple terms about flying and choices, and doing your best when situations were difficult. They listened with the abstract attention of children who didn't quite grasp that the person telling the story was the person in the story, who couldn't yet understand that their grandmother had been young once, had been scared, had made decisions that seemed impossible from the safety of retrospect. But someday they would understand. Someday they'd look at this exhibit and recognize what it represented, not just one mission or one career, but the accumulated weight of service and sacrifice that every generation offered so the next could build on what came before. That was legacy. Not the dramatic moments, but the long arc of contribution, the example set consistently across time, the principles demonstrated through action rather than just explained through words. And standing there in the museum, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived in service to something larger than herself, Raina Vasquez felt the deep satisfaction of knowing she'd done that. She'd flown well. She'd taught well. She'd led well. She'd shown that excellence required no excuses and no compromises. That was enough.